Okay, I think we are recording. Great. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Erin Farley, and I'm one of JRSA's research associates. For those of you who are less familiar with JRSA, it stands for the Justice Research and Statistics Association, and we are a national nonprofit organization that's dedicated to the use of research and analysis to inform criminal and juvenile justice decision-making. And we are comprised of a network of researchers and practitioners, which at the core include directors and staff from the state statistical analysis centers. Before I introduce our presenters, I wanted to thank our partners at the Bureau of Justice Statistics for helping to make this webinar possible. So it is my pleasure today to welcome you to our webinar, 10 Propensity Score Matching or PSM Strategies Replicate RCT Results in Criminal Justice Research, a meta-analytic investigation. Today's webinar will be led by Dr. Christopher Campbell and Dr. Ryan Lebrecht. So Chris is an assistant professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Portland State University. Just to give you a quick background, his research interests include institutional and community corrections, offender rehabilitation and reentry, offender risk assessment use, juvenile justice, and the application of criminological theory. He also works as a consultant for state legislatures and departments of correction. His recent work can be seen in the Criminal Justice and Behavior Journal, Criminology and Public Policy, and Justice Quarterly. Ryan Lebrecht is also an assistant professor in the Department of Criminal Justice at Portland State University. He previously worked as a correctional officer, mental health counselor, juvenile program specialist, correctional social worker, probation and parole officer. His research interests focus on offender classification and assessment, correctional rehabilitation, restrictive housing, program implementation and evaluation, and the transfer of knowledge to practitioners and policymakers. Ryan's work has appeared in Crime and Delinquency, Criminal Justice and Behavior, Psychology, Public Policy and Law, and also the Prison Journal. So I'm very pleased to welcome Ryan and Chris, and I will pass the magic ball to you guys so that you can take over. So welcome.
Thank you, Erin. I appreciate that. I am Chris Campbell, and I'm here in the same room with my colleague, Dr. Ryan Lebrecht. And some of our goals for this particular presentation is that for those of you who aren't familiar with PSM strategies, that this might give you a brief introduction slash a little bit of confidence in whether or not you want to employ those types of strategies in your evaluation work, or for those of you who are familiar with PSM, you get a little bit of a better understanding of when to use it and how confident you should be and how comfortable you are in making causal conclusions about maybe your program evaluations. So before I begin, I want to make a few acknowledgments. First, this project was supported by the National Institute of Justice through a data resources program that focused specifically on secondary data. We also wish to thank Shenying Guo, Zach Hamilton, and Ajin Tunalilar for their valuable feedback in this whole process that we've accumulated over the last couple of years. And then we also want to extend our gratitude to the staff of JRSA for this opportunity to do this webinar, and also thank you all for your interest in our work. So we all know that randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, are essentially the gold standard in methodological strength. We place a lot of emphasis on that because it allows us to make causal connections or causal claims about the impact of a particular variable or intervention that we might be interested in most. However, as you all know, in criminal justice settings, RCTs are very difficult to employ. There's a lot of things that often go wrong, or it's for whatever logistical or ethical reasons, you simply can't employ one at all. You can't even design one. So in that spirit, back in the 80s, a couple of guys, Rosenbaum and Rubin, came up with this technique called propensity score modeling. And their aim was to essentially address these problematic issues that people researchers run into in observational studies in all social sciences. And this particular method was designed to simulate the randomization effects of a randomized controlled trial. Essentially, it balances groups or creates similar comparison groups using the likelihood of being in the treatment. So that predicted probability of being in the treatment, otherwise known as the propensity score, is essentially a summary of all the relevant observed measures that might go into modeling that decision to place someone into a treatment or a particular group. So over the last decade, many criminal justice researchers and agencies, as well as funders, have demonstrated a continued preference for propensity score modeling in evaluation research in particular, largely because they all know that RCTs are really difficult to employ in criminal justice settings. So, while some herald PSM as this type of panacea for evaluation research, because it sounds really attractive, and it tends to work in a lot of people's favor when they're trying to simulate that RCT, others, however, warn about certain inherent dangers in placing too much blind faith in a PSM's ability to estimate causal relationships. To test these concerns, essentially, we need cross-validation studies where you're essentially testing how propensity score modeling would be able to replicate the findings of a randomized controlled trial. However, there's very few cross-validation studies that exist, and they usually range in a number of various focus. So you have very big studies such as the Social Security Administration, where you're using a lot of massive data. And then you've also got these smaller studies that focus on smaller sample sizes, different number of covariates to use, etc. The point is there's not very many of them. And those that do exist have a number of mixed findings. So on the whole, we found that it is possible to achieve similar results as an RCT. However, propensity score modeling may also under and overestimate the treatment effects, as recently shown in Dong and Lipsy's evaluation of educational interventions. And sometimes it even yields an opposite effect in terms of the effect size estimate and statistical significance when looking at the larger data in particular. So all this is to suggest that there's still some debate as to whether or not PSM can accurately simulate the effects of a randomized controlled trial. So with this in mind, we set out to conduct an investigation on the ability of PSM techniques to replicate the findings of 10 criminal justice randomized controlled trials. The aim here is that if we are able to find that PSM is able to simulate RCT findings, then we have some evidentiary support for its continued use in criminal justice research. However, of course, if it fails to replicate the RCT findings, then this evidence suggests that we should probably reduce our heavy reliance on PSM in CJ. Briefly, our methodological overview for this entire project is essentially these 7 steps. We'll be diving into each one of these a little bit more in depth as we go. But to start off, we had to find the randomized controlled trials to actually test. This involved a focus on National Archive criminal justice data through ICPSR, and I'll talk about some of the eligibility criteria for that. We then had to introduce artificial selection bias, which is essentially removing the balanced effects of a randomization procedure in an RCT. Then we conducted several PSM analyses, of which we'll expand on, but essentially some of them are the more common techniques that we'll find in criminal justice. And then we examined the balance of the randomized controlled trials in relation to the PSM techniques. How close or how much bias could the PSM technique actually reduce once employed into a biased sample. Then we examined the outcomes, examined the difference essentially in Cohen's D between the PSM and the RCT estimates. We meta-analyzed those results across the 10 studies, and then we conducted also a moderator analysis to determine some of the importance of focusing on things like bias for PSM. So first, the eligibility criteria. As I mentioned, we use the NACJD to find our randomized control trials. Through this process, we had a baseline selection criteria of these 2 points. First, all of the cases must be randomly assigned to conditions, and this seems kind of basic, but you would probably guess that a host of these studies that actually said that they were RCTs actually ended up having something fail halfway through, or they didn't actually randomize it, but they set out to do that randomization process. So with that, we had the second selection criteria in which we needed a certain number of cases per condition, and this was set essentially through a power analysis that we worked backwards through to ensure that we would have enough cases to do one of the more data-hungry approaches, which is one-to-one greedy matching. So the process, this whole process identified 9 eligible studies out of 46 potential RCTs that were actually randomized controlled trials. So those 9 actually met both of the criteria, and the 46 tended to not have enough cases per condition for us to actually examine. So we included, with this 9 eligible studies, we included 1 additional quasi-experimental design study because we wanted to get that 10 threshold especially for the reliability in the meta-analysis, but also this particular quasi-experiment created their control group and their treatment group in a temporal fashion, in that they identified the eligibility control cases and then monitored them, then rolled out a program and examined the treatment cases that essentially got that program that looked similar. These studies varied in focus, so we included policing studies, court studies, and correction studies. Second was our artificial selection bias. So inherent in a randomized controlled trial, you have essentially the void of selection bias because of the randomization process. All the groups essentially are going to look very similar. So in order to employ propensity score modeling, which is designed to remove the selection bias, we had to artificially essentially introduce that selection bias. And we did so with these 4 steps. First, we determined, actually Dr. Lebrecht determined what critical study variables we needed to include in our study using the NACJD reports that are provided with the data sets. We then identified measures that best predict the treatment group placement. So essentially we're finding those measures that will condition the propensity score. Third, we constructed an additive scale from those predictive variables, and within that additive scale score, we selected only the treatment cases that were above the additive scale's mean to create what we call the bias sample. It's important to note that this process was somewhat of a blind process, in that Dr. Lebrecht carried out all these actions, these steps, and then I went through and did essentially the propensity score modeling and employed all of the different techniques so that I wouldn't know what variables he used to introduce the bias. So I'm going into it as a researcher would, knowing that there's a selection bias going on, but you're trying to essentially model that process through the available covariates. The description of our sample, our final sample, included those 10 studies. One of those 10 studies involved 2 separate randomized controls, so they had multiple groups, which we were able to examine as the 11th effect size. The average sample size was 573, with a pretty wide range in how many cases they had. The average number of covariates per study was about 71, so this is important to keep in mind, as that's the number that you can actually examine to assess the balance, as well as condition the covariates for the propensity score. And then the mean number of outcomes per study ranged from 5 to 22, with an average of 9. the mean percent of the original treatment group identified as a bias sample. So after Dr. Lebrecht employed those steps to introduce the bias, we had an average of 42% of the original sample, the original treatment group sample, in our now biased estimate, or our now biased sample rather. So as I mentioned, after Ryan was done with implementing or introducing the selection bias, I then went through and employed the 7 PSM variant techniques, essentially. Excuse me. We used one-to-one with and without a caliper, one-to-one matching with and without a caliper, one-to-many matching with and without a caliper, inverse probability of the treatment weighting, or IPTW, stratified weighting scheme, and optimal pairs matching. For those of you who are unfamiliar with these, I'll give you a brief rundown, which you can find in our report. All of this you can find in our report, but particularly this. Essentially, in a one-to-one match, for every one treatment case, there is only one control case matched to it. The one-to-one matching for this study employed a greedy matching style, which identifies the first closest match, essentially the nearest neighbor, and removes the pair without replacement. In a one-to-many match, for every one treatment case, there are, of course, multiple control cases matched. And we set the optimal number of matched control cases by using a couple of formulas found in the literature by Hansen and Austin in their studies about one-to-one, or one-to-many, rather. And for our study, the one-to-many matching was also done with replacement, meaning that control cases could be used multiple times, and they were weighted by the number of times that they were actually used as a match. When we employed calipers, they're essentially calculated from the standard deviation of the propensity score multiplied by 0.25, which is the expectation set by Rosenbaum and Rubin. Once the propensity scores are conditioned for each study's bias sample, all PSM approaches for that RCT relied on the same score. So once we set a propensity score in the one-to-one matching, for instance, we use that same propensity score for all of the techniques. Propensity scores were calculated using logistic regression, and any covariate that possessed over a 10% bias or was statistically significant in its difference between the treatment and control cases was used in conditioning the propensity score. The IPTW, or the inverse probability of the treatment weighting, involves a weighting formula that gives more statistical strength to those cases that look most like the treatment group and less to those who are most different in the propensity score. This particular technique is often used when you don't want to lose a lot of cases, or you might lose a lot of cases in one-to-one matching when you can't find a match, essentially, or what's known as common support. So people will employ the MPTW in order to keep those cases, but you have you could have potentially significant weights for those that look less and less like the actual treatment cases. Stratified weighting splits the propensity score into equal strata and weights the cases by their within strata proportions. And then optimal pairs matching is similar to one-to-one matching in that it uses pairs, but instead of taking the nearest neighbor, the process selects matched pairs by assessing and optimizing, or reducing, the overall difference in the treatment and control groups. The optimal pair matching was conducted using the program R, while all the other approaches we use data. So we assessed the balance of our PSM techniques in relation to the randomized control trials. So we have applied all of these comparison indices, these 6 comparison indices, to the RCT, to the bias sample, and to the PSM samples, and we examined them across ways, essentially, to see where they were different in PSM's ability to actually reduce the bias. The statistical significance we focused on was Niemann and Pearson's approach to the p-value essentially setting the alpha at 0.05. Essentially, our aim there is to try use PSM to try to get the statistical significantly different covariates between the treatment and control group down to about 5% of the covariates being significant, which is essentially similar to that of an RCT, or at least that you would expect with an RCT. The standardized percent bias is a common method of identifying the degree to which treatment and control groups differ, and is the preferred method over simply using the Nearman-Pearson approach to statistical significance, largely because it is sensitive to sample size. According to Rosenbaum and Rubin, the treatment and control groups should not differ more on a given covariate more than 20%, with less than 10% being ideal. Thus, the 4 ways that we assess the groups on the standardized bias included the average standardized percent bias, the maximum percent bias of a particular covariate, the overall percent of covariates that were over 20% bias, and over 10% bias. Lastly, we examined the receiver operating characteristic, or area under the curve, as this is a sensitivity check to gauge how well the propensity score predicts if a case is in the treatment group. So the closer a PSM technique can get to any of these ideal benchmarks, the closer the technique is to replicating the RCT. With that AUC, we're essentially trying to get down to 0.5, which is essentially a coin flip, which is what you would expect from an RCT. So to give you a breakdown of some of our modeled balance summary statistics that I just laid out for you, our original RCTs had a number of things that you would expect from them. First of all, the percent significant differences, as I mentioned, you want them around 5%. Our RCTs had an average of 9.3% for the covariants that were statistically significant in terms of their differences between the treatment and control groups. This is kind of understandable because they were largely field experiments, and sometimes it wouldn't go perfectly, but it was still pretty darn close. The mean standardized bias for the original RCTs was 7.8, which is below that 10% threshold that is ideal. And then the percent of covariates with that had a bias over 20 was 5.6, which is also pretty great. Our bias sample suggested that we were successful in introducing bias, noting a couple of points here where the percent significant difference across covariates between the treatment and control jumped to 36.9% of those covariates were statistically different. And then the mean standardized bias jumped from 7.8 to 20.7. That area under the curve suggests that our propensity score, that once we conditioned it, was able to predict being in the treatment group about 85%, with about 85% accuracy. And then once we employed our PSM, so this is an average of our PSM techniques across these different comparison indices. A few things to note here is that the percent significant differences dropped even below that of the RCT, so even fewer, on average, even fewer covariates were statistically significant across the treatment and control groups than the RCT was. The mean standardized bias was not quite as good as the RCT, but still right near that 10% ideal threshold. And then the area under the curve was somewhat better than the RCT at a point closer to 0.5 or 0.58. The other three that I highlighted in yellow here are somewhat a little bit cautious, noting that there are still some covariates that have a wide percent bias. At 40% bias, that is pretty substantial, and that could be something that sways a propensity score, or it sways potentially how your outcomes might turn out. For this last bit, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Ryan here, and he's going to walk you through how we examine the effect sizes and then the meta-analytic results.
All right, thanks, Chris. Hi, everybody. So next we're going to get into sort of the meat and potatoes of the project, right? So we wanted to calculate an effect size, and we needed to have something that was common across all the studies. So we chose to use Cohen's d because of its intuitive appeal, easy to understand. So what we did was we calculated the Cohen's d along with the 95% confidence interval for each of the study outcomes. And keep in mind, as Chris mentioned before, there are a number of outcomes within each study. So some had, a range. They may have 5 different outcomes like new arrest, new conviction, parole violation, etc. So there were a total of 104 outcomes across the 11 studies that we looked at. And what we did was we then calculated one for each of the PSM methods, and then we compared those to the original RCT. So here we're treating the RCT findings for the effect size as being the truth and checking whether or not the PSM effect sizes are able to replicate that. And then we essentially sort of compared those two effect sizes on a number of dimensions, including statistical significance. So the question being, if you find a statistically significant finding in the RCT, did you also find one in the PSM estimates? We also wanted to focus on direction. So if RCT finds a positive effect, what did you also find a positive effect with the PSM? Most importantly, we focused on the magnitude of the effects. If you're getting a large effect from RCT and a small effect from PSM, that's important to note. And finally, we're looking at the overlap, or the percentage of overlap between the two effect sizes. So here we're looking, we'll look at the comparative results, and I'm going to sort of just walk through these. The first thing that we looked at, and you'll note that all of the PSM methods that Chris described are here on the left-hand side. And the first one, which is the percentage of the effect sizes that share the same statistical significance and direction. So if the RCT was significant at 0.05 and it was positive, did you also have a significant and positive effect with the PSM method? And as you can see, there's a couple things that stand out. The one-to-one matching methods seem to do a little bit better. So you can see that in the one-to-one with and without a caliper, they're in the upper 60s range, and the optimal pairs, which is also a one-to-one matching method, is right around 65%. On the other hand, you see this one in red, the inverse probability is less than 50%. So that's a little concerning. The next thing that we looked at was the percentage of the PSM estimates and whether or not they were greater than the RCT effect sizes. And what we see here is that across the board, pretty consistent across the different types, ranging from around 70 to 75%, indicating that PSM tends to overestimate the RCT effect sizes. Here we looked at the percentage of the PSM effect sizes that fell within the 95% confidence interval of the RCT effect sizes. So if they fall within that range, they're not statistically different from one another, but if they're outside those boundaries, they would be considered a statistically significant difference. What you see here, again, are that the one-to-one approaches seem to do a bit better. The one-to-one with no caliper, for example, 89% of those PSM effect sizes fell within the confidence interval of the RCT. The inverse probability was around 63.5, so much lower in terms of performance. And finally, we looked at the correlation between the PSM effect size and the RCT effect size. And as you can see clearly across the board, these are pretty high correlations, all above 0.93, indicating that they're pretty related to one another. So next we get into the actual meta-analysis. And for this procedure, what we had to start with is to create one sort of effect size for each study. And what we did is we averaged all of the outcomes within each study. So if a study had 5 outcomes, we took the average of that for the PSM and for the RCT, and we combined them together. So we've got one effect size for RCT and one for each of the PSM methods. And then we calculated this new meta-analysis effect size as being the difference in the D value between the PSM and the RCT results. So it's important to keep in mind when I show you the meta-analysis results, we're looking at the difference in D between PSM and RCT. And given that it's essentially the PSM estimate minus RCT, if we get an effect size of 0 here, that would indicate that PSM perfectly replicates the RCT. However, if we have a positive effect size, that would indicate that there is an overestimation, right? The PSM estimate is higher than the RCT. And conversely, if we have a negative effect size, that's going to indicate that the PSM estimate underreports or underestimates the RCT. In our meta-analysis, we use a random effects model. And I will sort of draw your attention to sort of the main meta-analytic findings. You see here in the middle, these are the PSM types comparing. And if I'll sort of start at the left-hand side of this table, these are the p-values. As you can see, there are only 2 effect sizes that are different, and that would be the one-to-many with no caliper and the stratified weighting, that there are statistically different between the PSM method and the RCT. You have the N here, which is how many cases went into the meta-analysis, noting that the one-to-ones have fewer cases than the weighting methods, given the nature of how they are matched. The I-squared is a measure of heterogeneity, which, according to Higgins and Thompson, this ranges I-squared from 0 to 100%. 0 would indicate that there's less variability within those effect sizes. Where you get closer to 100, that indicates there's a lot of heterogeneity within the effect sizes. So for most of these PSM methods, we have low variability. For the inverse probability, we have 63%, which indicates that there's some effect sizes in here that are small, some that are large. It's kind of more of a variation, which is important to note. Finally, when you look at the confidence intervals over here on the right-hand side, this is, again, the difference in D values. So 0 would be perfect replication. It's important to note just visually, if you look at the confidence intervals, there's a tremendous amount of overlap across the 7 methods. There's none that, that don't overlap with one another. Another thing to point out, if you look at the point estimates right here in the middle, they all fall below a difference of 0.10, right? The one that appears to do the best is the one-to-one with no caliper, followed by one-to-one with caliper. These are pretty tight, and then optimal pairs, and then the rest. It's also important to note that the upper bounds of the confidence interval over here on the right-hand side, none of those meet that threshold of 0.20, which if we refer to Cohen's guidelines for the interpreting the size of Cohen's d-value, 0.2 would indicate a small difference. If we were to meet that would be indicated that there's quite a bit of a difference between PSM and the RCT. One of the benefits of doing meta-analysis rather than just focusing on one study to conduct these analyses is that it allowed us the opportunity to conduct some moderator analyses, which I think are important. First off, when we look at which methods perform the best, grouping them, right? The one-to-one approaches seem to perform the best with the data that we had. The effect size was 0.05, which is pretty close to 0 here, which is much better than the weighting methods, which are at 0.08, and the one-to-many. One of the other questions that we could address is, well, what's the benefit of using versus not using a caliper? With our data, we found that there was very little difference in the effectiveness of the PSM methods with or without the caliper. For the one-to-one approach, there was only a difference of 0.02, and for the one-to-many, it was 0.01. Now, the next couple things that we looked at, I kind of got to give you a little background. The first has to do with the number of covariates that were available to go into the match. And this is kind of a crude way of doing this, but since we don't know exactly what are the standards for how many variables you should rely on, we broke the studies, the 11 effect sizes, we split them in the middle. So we looked at the total number of covariates that were available, and we averaged those. Those that had the mean value or higher were considered the more covariates, and those less were fewer. And this might seem counterintuitive, but the studies who had fewer covariates available actually produced more valid results than the ones that had more covariates available. And this difference wasn't trivial. There was an average difference of 0.04 compared to 0.08 respectively. And I'll explain in a moment what to make of some of that finding. And finally, I think this is, to me, the most interesting finding of the entire study, which is we looked at the post-match bias. And it's important to note that when Chris was describing the bias, he was looking at the PSM. That was all of the 7 types averaged together. But when you peel those apart, and if anyone who is interested, we'll also make available the report with the full tables. You see that there's variation in how well each one of the methods is able to reduce the bias. And what we did was we looked at the 6 measures, the 6 bias indices, and we rank ordered them from 1 to 7, I'm sorry. And we essentially took those that, that performed the best on those 6 measures, and we took the mean, and those that were able to reduce the bias the most had much better results than those that had less bias reduction. And this difference, again, wasn't trivial. It was a difference of a D of 0.07 compared to 0.11. So what to make of our study? Well, first of all, and most importantly, I think our work provides some support for the continued use of PSM in criminal justice research. Our results suggest that PSM is an effective means for simulating an RCT experiment. Right, to highlight some of the significant findings, PSM replicated the direction and the magnitude of RCT findings to a really high degree. The magnitude of the effect size differences between PSM and RCT were relatively small, a range of D from 0.03 to 0.09. Furthermore, in 5 of the 7 comparisons, the differences in D were not statistically different than 0. So a good day for PSM here. On the other hand, we do find, or the study does raise some concerns about using PSM to estimate causal effects. First of all, none of the PSM techniques that we had analyzed had more than 89% of the effect size fall within the 95% confidence interval of the RCT. So at best, 11% of those effect sizes were statistically dissimilar from the RCT findings. Another important thing to consider is that the majority of the PSM estimates actually overestimated the treatment effects. We should keep that in mind in conducting and interpreting PSM. Essentially, while on the whole PSM did a good job, right, when we looked at all of the effect sizes together, one of the things is that at some point, each of the techniques sort of broke down and had an estimate that was significantly different from the RCT on one or more of the outcome measures. So we have here 3 recommendations for the application of PSM that I think will be important for folks using and reading about PSM. First has to do with balance. It may not surprise you, but in a lot of CJ studies, you don't see a lot of people reporting the balance statistics or showing that they've achieved balance. And what we would recommend is that at a minimum, researchers should include the 6 measures of 6 indices that are described here and also disseminate those results in their reports and their publications. The second recommendation has to do with we should strive to collect quality versus quantity measures. If we only focus on digging up more administrative data or the like to increase the number of covariates to go into the match versus having theoretically relevant quality covariates, this may actually be counterproductive and may increase the bias in the results. And finally, we would argue that at this point, it makes sense to check the findings of your PSM analyses against other techniques to sort of gain confidence in the results. And if the results do differ, say if you're using a 1-to-1 and then you try a weighting scheme, we would say that you should probably give attention to a few factors, which is what are the measures that go into the propensity score? Are they theoretical? What about the common support between the treatment and control group, right? What's the compatibility? And also, are there limitations of the specific PSM techniques that are used, right? Have other people had problems with it? According to our own study, it looks like the inverse probability weighting, if you get a different result, there's at least some indication here that that particular strategy didn't perform the best. And if there are doubts about which technique to use or report, our findings suggest that you should probably err on the side of whichever method creates or has the greatest bias reduction. So in conclusion, we think that researchers should approach the use and interpretation with PSM with a cautious optimism. Our cross-validation meta-analysis provides strong evidence that PSM is an effective approach for estimating causal effects most of the time. It seems in the absence of an RCT, PSM is a good method to estimate those causal relationships. Nevertheless, our study did not replicate those experimental findings with absolute accuracy. In some cases, PSM overestimates treatment effects quite concerningly. So we really need, more research in this area to hone in on, what are the conditions that PSM is more or less effective. And, that would help sort of researchers in the future. So that concludes our presentation. This is our contact information. We also have the presentation available for folks as well as the NIJ report if anyone's interested. And we are available if anybody has any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris and Ryan. We do have one question. Let's see. From Eric, he was saying he said very interesting study and asked about if you didn't run any Rosenbaum bound. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, that's a great question and a great point. We were debating as to whether or not we should dive into the looking into the sensitivity analyses, and that's definitely an area that we want to examine. We haven't gotten there yet. Largely because we are already pushing the boundaries of our time frame with the NIJ. So that's definitely an area that we're going to be exploring here soon, as well as non-inferiority tests to determine statistically, is it how much of a concern, how much of a distance in D is really a major concern. That's a great question.
Great. Thank you. I feel like I'm getting a little feedback. I'm not sure where it's coming from, so I apologize for that. Let me see if I turn down my volume. Okay, hopefully that's not hurting anyone's ears anymore. I'll give a second if we have any other questions, and then we can also launch the poll. One of my questions is just, this was a great study, and you sort of just spoke to some of the directions you might be looking forward, investigating in the future. Is there anything else that you guys have sort of in the future related to this type of work?
Yeah, actually, there's a number of things that we were not able to examine in this particular study, such as coarsened exact matching or the matching estimators that are becoming more and more popular. We were also looking into examining various other types of PSM techniques as well as statistical software. There's some people have raised concern about, well, is PSM treated or employed the same in SPSS as it is in STATA and in R, where the users might have a little bit more control over when a match or a weighting scheme is employed and how. So that's a couple of the directions that we plan on going for that, as well as collecting more RCTs as time goes on, and hopefully adding to this. And I think one other thing that we haven't checked out just yet is sample size. So a lot of our studies here that we examined were, they ranged in sample size, but a lot of them were around the lower end of our threshold, hence why we only had the 9 RCTs and then we added the 1 extra. And a lot of the cross-validation studies that have shown a major difference between PSM and RCTs used sample sizes that were thousands or hundreds of thousands, and the concern becomes, okay, well, at what point should we be concerned with the covariates that are going into the propensity score given the sample size.
Yeah, and the one other thing that we are looking into next is, so we've estimated whether PSM can replicate the RCT, but the other question is, what about other multivariate regression analyses? So how well does binary logistic or OLS regression, how close do those methods come to estimating the RCT? And is there a benefit of doing PSM or multivariate regression, which I think is going to be a really important finding, because if PSM doesn't get as close as you want, what other strategies are available? And Chris mentioned some of the other more sophisticated ones, but I think in criminal justice we tend to see the use of multivariate regression, and this may help weigh in on when to use regression versus PSM methods.
Oh, great. Well, that all sounds very exciting. I think we'll have to keep an eye out for that work in the future. Where is your paper available? Is that the one that I know that you had just sent me to post on our website? And so I don't know if that's the primary one you want people to go to. We will, as I said, we will make that available. Is there anything else that you would like to direct people to read about this work?
Yeah, so the primary paper right now to check out is the report that we submitted to you all. That's the report that we submitted to the NIJ. But however, there's going to be some differences, big differences between that one and what we're submitting to peer review, which is estimated to go out in the next week or so. So if you want to, if anybody wants to contact us about some of the things that are going into the peer review publication rather than the NIJ report, feel free to email us.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, again, we will be posting this with the supporting materials on our website in just a couple of days. And I think that is it. The poll should be up any second now, but Chris and Ryan, thank you so much for leading this webinar today. I greatly appreciate it, and people obviously can reach out to you at the contact information listed, and we have a couple of webinars coming up, so everybody keep your eyes out for that and please register. So great, thank you so much.
Thank you, Erin, appreciate it.
Okay, take care.